I can't believe I've never reacted to this video. Oversimplified's best of all time. Not only is it his top video with over 100 million views nearly, it's also just the top World War II long-form video on all of YouTube. Only getting beaten out by a couple of YouTube shorts. And I'm really excited to do this because every year I feel like I kind of get to learn more and more about this subject. It feels like every single week of me making videos, I learn more and more like weird details about WW2. I'm not complaining, I actually love it. I love that we're also starting off, I love when history videos, side note, talk about events leading up to the war. Like, you really can't grasp it fully until you go like a couple decades back. Another thing I love about Oversimplified style, look at this map. You got a green Italy, a red Austria-Hungary, yellow Switzerland. I mean, he's coloring the countries correctly. It's a small detail, but you really always got to color the countries correctly. Imagine making a country like France yellow for whatever reason. Ugh. So of course it all starts with Benito Mussolini. He is the first fascist leader. Also, fun fact, San Marino is the nation that becomes the world's second fascist nation. They pretty much chose that ideology right after their dad Italy did. Okay, it's 1902.
A young man by the name of Benito Mussolini moves from Italy
even
to
before
Switzerland
World War I.
Military service. He gets big into socialism, working for trade unions, writing for socialist
which is so ironic considering the face of the new movement he becomes known for because he was big into socialism. One thing I just can't get it out of my mind right now, does this look like a socialist building to you? Well, you know what? Maybe. Actually, this would have made it look better though. Love the accurate map of Europe in the background.
Advocating a violent overthrow of European monarchies, the whole shebang.
Yes.
This gets him
Remember at that time, yeah, like basically all of Europe was still ruled over by kings and queens monarchies. And that was only a little over 100 years ago. It's crazy to think about.
Trouble with the Swiss police. So he gets arrested, sent back to Italy, set free, returns to Switzerland, is arrested again, goes back to Italy again, completes his military service after previously avoiding it, and then after a brief stint as an elementary school teacher.
There's got to be a joke in there about, I don't know, something, Swiss, Italy, his upbringing in Switzerland, I don't know.
He finally returns to work
There's something
as an avid
there.
socialist. His speeches and journalistic abilities made him famous among Italian socialists. He was anti-war, so when Italy colonized Libya in 1910, he rioted and got arrested.
Yeah, remember that was a war against the Ottoman Empire because, you know, the Ottomans had been the dying man of Europe for a long time by then.
So when Italy colonized Libya in 1910, he rioted and
went
got
to jail.
arrested. Then World War I came along, and once again, he protested Italy's involvement.
Crazy how many fascist leaders went to jail. A certain mustache man did as well. You gotta go to jail if you want to become a political leader, I guess.
Wait a minute, this war could bring about the social climate needed to overthrow European monarchies and bring about the socialist revolution everywhere.
Again, yes, I mean, Karl Marx, who was German, imagined it being more in Germany or the United Kingdom, not in the Russian Empire.
Suddenly he was pro-war, but his fellow socialists didn't like his new pro-war stance, so they kicked him out of the party. So then he said, you know what? I'm done with socialism. We need something new, not based on class divisions tearing us apart, but based on unity through nationality. We'll conquer the Mediterranean and reunite all Italian peoples, just like the days of the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
I'll call it fascismo, and it will guide the Italian nation to greatness.
Yes, brown shirts. Ah, I see he's wearing a brown shirt there. Although in Italy, they were the black shirts. I always get confused on who was the black shirts, who were the brown shirts. Brown shirts were in Germany.
That's all well and good, Mr. Mussolini, but what kind of haircut am I giving you?
Doesn't matter.
Let's go with...
He's going bald.
Bold.
Wow, beautiful. Yeah, he was gonna have to rock that look. Wow. I don't know if I've seen very many images of him in the swimsuit, but I'm glad that I did now. World War II.
Italy had been on the winner's side in World War I, and they hoped they were going to get a lot out of it.
Yes.
But in the end, they only got a little. And
so that was going to make a lot of the Italians extremely mad, pushing them towards this like sort of nationalistic fascism direction.
They felt cheated. On top of that, a bad economy and weak government.
They also joined in pretty early, a lot earlier than the Americans did. All the way back in 1915, only a year after it started, the Americans didn't join until 1917.
Cheated. On top of that, a bad economy and weak governments meant that the Italian people were a little unhappy. So when Mussolini came along and said that he could fix everything, his fascist movement gained a lot of support.
Yeah.
In 1922, he went to the king and said, "Make me prime minister or I'll make me prime minister." And the king said, "You and what army?" "This army."
There you go. He had a lot of people on his side.
Then he went about establishing
I like how they all went bald for him.
himself at its center. Europe had its first fascist dictator. Next up, Germany. Germany had been on the loser's side, and they got
But it was
absolutely
significantly after. You're talking a whole 11 years before Germany actually elects their fascist leader. That always is a fact I feel like it's really shocking. So you kind of had like fascism like just hanging around in Europe at that time during the 20s. It wasn't like it was all overnight. So maybe the people were a little bit more used to just being like, oh, that's that Italian thing.
By the Treaty of Versailles. They lost territory, had to demilitarize the Rhineland, had to reduce their army to just 100,000 men.
So even though both countries in World War I were on opposite sides, they shared one thing in common: they had a lot of angry people.
An air force had to pay the Allies a huge amount of money that it didn't have, and a new rule was established that every Englishman withheld the right to walk into the center of Berlin, pick out any German they wanted, and spank the hell out of them. I made that last...
And essentially, that's how they felt. Obviously, this is like a joke, but literally how the Germans felt about the whole thing.
One up, but it helps you understand how all of this felt to Germans. On top of that, a bad economy and weak governments meant that when a small angry man with a silly mustache came along and said that he could fix everything,
I mean, having an angry populace, that's a recipe for disaster. People are going to start to vote in some pretty wild stuff.
People loved it. Hitler had been a soldier during World War I, and he was crazy patriotic, and nobody was madder than him about
is that a Belgian flag?
Germany's humiliation. He helped start a new political party.
I like that he's shown kissing the old Imperial German borders here. Wait, why Belgian? It'd be interesting because he's Austrian if it was like...
patriotic, and nobody was
so these are the old World War I, pre-World War I
He
German
helped start a
borders.
new political party, and in 1923 attended a march on Munich with his boys.
Blur out all those.
But his popularity grew and grew, and in 1933, the president made him chancellor. He believed he was Germany's great destined savior, and he went full megalomaniac.
I wish there was a joke about him also going to jail, writing a certain book, which we will not name.
A dictatorship with himself at its center. Europe had fascist dictator number 2. Hitler and Mussolini had a lot of the same...
Well, you know, again, it's not a very big deal, but San Marino numbers 2.
Ideas, but
now San Marino is really going to make much difference. There's like 40 people living there, but you know.
And they started to get along. Anyone else want to be friends? Franco? No? You good? I do. Who's that?
Yeah. Well, they helped Franco in the Spanish Civil War. I mean, Franco, in another universe, if the Spanish Civil War took place I don't know if the Spanish Civil War ends up being the same if it takes place any earlier than 1936. Maybe if it was in 1933, right when Hitler took power in Germany so that the Germans could go down there and support the fascist side. But yeah, this nation was absolutely wrecked after the Civil War. They were not prepared to fight in World War II.
More importantly, they had the same enemies, and they started to get along. Anyone else want to be friends?
Yeah, so no...
Franco? No? You good? I do.
Nah, man.
Who's that? It's Japan, and they've taken over northern China. Let's rewind a bit.
Japan because okay, so this goes into a whole nother argument. When is the official World War II start date? A lot of people say it's 1939, September 1st, when the Germans go into Poland. But if you think about it, in Asia, the Asian theater started way before that.
It itself from the rest of the world for over 200 years until the Americans showed up and said, "You're going to trade with us, and you're going to like it." Then the Western powers
stopped having the nation be closed. Open the borders. Bill Wirtz moment. Yeah, so they were isolationists.
The Americans showed up and said, "You're going to trade with us, and you're going to like it." Then the Western powers imposed a bunch of unequal treaties, meaning Japan's economy was bust. They also had no natural resources, so they decided to go get some. They went to war with China to gain a sphere of influence over Korea.
They literally tried their hand at being the whole Western imperial power in a way more brutal way, as you'll come to find out.
They took a bunch of Chinese stuff.
You know, imperial empires kind of tend to be pretty brutal as a whole, but Japan definitely, they set a new precedent. I don't think we're going to get into that too much into this video, but
then the West said, "Hey, cut that out." And since Japan couldn't take on the West, they said, "Okay, I guess we'll just go home." Wait a minute, what are you doing? Taking advantage of a weakened China and setting up spheres of influence. But I was the one who weakened them. We know. And you guys didn't let me have anything. We know. Yeah. That seems unfair. We don't think so.
It's all about the Western. It's funny that Germany is the one that's saying this, but again, when nations feel like they were treated unfairly, they get angry. They try to get revenge. China's the perfect example. Now, this is before World War I. Obviously, Japan was a part of the Allied Entente side, part of the French and British side. That was not going to be the case for
Okay, see ya. So Japan thought, screw this, and went to war with Russia, and stunned everyone by actually winning.
Yes, the Russo-Japanese War, absolutely insane. Now, the entire Russian fleet was out here in the Baltic Sea and had to make a massive journey over towards the Pacific Ocean. Then got their butt kicked immediately once they got there. But yeah, a lot of Russia is more of this, not so much this. Regardless, it was a very impressive victory. This really embarrassed the Russians. Keep in mind, too, the Germans saw that in World War I, thought they could easily bully the Tsar Russia after that. If you think about it, they kind of had their own brief moment of century of humiliation. That's a term that China uses, but they definitely had a couple decades there of humiliation, so no wonder they went communist.
So Japan thought, screw this, and went to war with Russia, and stunned everyone by actually winning. Then they fully annexed Korea, but they didn't stop there. In World War I, they took Germany's
Korea. Also, they had Taiwan, 1895 is when they got this island. But yeah, the Russians had this area for a while there. Lots of other European powers with spheres of influence.
In World War I, they took Germany's colonies and islands in Asia. That was their reward. And then in an incident that was maybe staged by the Japanese army, a bomb blew up the Japanese train in Manchuria, giving them an excuse to launch an invasion and take over. So here's the situation. Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Japan all believe they're racially superior, all feel hostility towards the Allies.
Did Japan think they were... Oh, well, definitely the Japanese thought they were racially superior to China, the Koreans. Okay, I guess that, yeah, just wanted to make sure.
Want to militarize and take
I mean, the thing that there was kind of a little bit of a difference, I feel, between the superior thing and with the way Germans saw themselves. I mean, Germans thought they were superior to quite literally everyone. Except for the Japanese, they were honorary Aryan for whatever reason.
For more stuff.
Because Japan was their ally.
Let's start with Germany. Hitler hated the Treaty of Versailles, and now he was ready to begin undoing it. In complete violation of the treaty,
did Japan
the first
think they were
Luftwaffe
superior
squadrons
to...
were set up,
they were pretty cool in Poland.
And he pimped up his army. The Allies did nothing. Then Hitler sent his army back into the demilitarized Rhineland, giving orders to immediately retreat if the Allies showed up.
We're all just thinking of like Hoi 4 focus trees that is slowly remilitarize the Rhineland, Anschluss, Austria, take back the Sudetenlands.
Did nothing. With his military re-strengthened, he could now move on to step 2.
Jazz up the army.
He wanted to rapidly increase the Aryan population, and to do so, he needed Lebensraum. Or in other words, he would have to take over the world. But for now, a good point.
And another interesting thing to think about here too, because I see maps about ethnic Germans that lived out here east of Germany. It's not this case anymore, but back in the day, this is what the map looked like, and I'm sure this was some of his justification on why they should expand out eastward. There was already these German settlements literally all over the continent, and other races, specifically Slavs.
Or in other words,
he did not want that.
Take over the world. But for now, a good portion of Europe would do, and he began eyeing up his neighbors. The Allies finally started to get worried, so they implemented a fairly useless diplomatic strategy called appeasement, and it went a little something like this.
I like how Germany's already getting ready to like punch Poland in the face. Like, it was pretty apparent what was going to happen. Meanwhile, these two are just sitting back and watching.
Hitler would say, I want that thing. And the Allies would say, you can't have that thing. Okay, you can have that thing, but no more. I want that thing.
Yeah.
And
so first the Anschluss of Austria,
Hitler's army marched into Austria and just took it with no resistance.
Yeah.
Boom. This is Germany now.
Bam.
Next, he demanded to be given the Sudetenland, an area of Czechoslovakia with many ethnic Germans. The Allies held a meeting with Hitler in Munich and said, look, we're going to give you what... Hang on. This meeting is about my territory. Shouldn't I come to the meeting too?
This is so funny.
Anyway, we're going to give you
I love
what
how
you
he
want.
highlights that moment.
Really?
Because, yeah, it's like, isn't there someone you forgot to ask?
Yeah. Just like that? Yep.
That's literally, I think, where the meme no, I don't even know where the meme template, where that comes from. But this is probably the single best use of this meme format, because that's literally what took place in history. They were just negotiating for this guy's land. I like how Hitler and Mussolini have the oversimplified artistic style. Meanwhile, they're just stick figures and heads. Clearly, they're not going to be characters for a very long time in this story.
Just like that? Yep. What's the catch? Just sign this piece of paper promising you won't invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. Okay.
That'll
then
definitely
Chamberlain
work.
returned home victorious, waving his signed piece of paper in the air, declaring crisis to be averted and the continuation of world peace. And we built a statue of Chamberlain in his honor, and every day on the 30th of September we celebrate Chamberlain Day. Hitler's invading the rest of Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
What? He's invading the rest of Czechoslovakia. Oh.
Yeah.
You lied to me.
What a disaster.
What do you expect? I'm Hitler. Not to be outdone, Mussolini also wanted to get in on the action.
There you go.
He thought to himself, isn't there a not yet colonized nation somewhere which is so underdeveloped that
Ethiopia,
the people would be defending themselves against our tanks with literal bows and arrows and wooden spears?
Yes.
Oh, there is?
He wanted revenge too, because the Italians tried it earlier and it didn't go so well.
Fantastic. And so he took it. Italy also wanted to control the entrance to the Adriatic Sea, so they occupied Albania.
Bam.
Then, in another incident which was...
you would think, they occupied Albania, you would think that the future war they would declare on Greece would have gone so much better for the Italians. But obviously it didn't. They were embarrassed. The Greeks, stood up to the Italians. The Germans had to come on down and help them.
Maybe staged by the Japanese. Gunfire was exchanged by
that's
Japanese
what you gotta do.
Chinese.
I mean, if it's not obvious, we've been doing that for so long in history, staging events, saying it was the other guy. That's the reason why we need to start this war up. Gotta trick your populace into thinking this is a defensive war.
Troops at the Marco Polo Bridge. And the Japanese launched yet another invasion against China. They swept through Beijing and Shanghai, and then advanced through the Yangtze Valley to China's then capital, Nanking. It was here that saw the worst of Japan's shocking atrocities committed against the Chinese people. Back in Europe, Germany and Italy...
Oversimplified does a very good job of, it was obviously a dark... This is like a dark subject, obviously. There's a lot of terrible things that happened in World War II. But it's such a good job of walking that line of hey, we're trying to show this to people that are probably very young. You can't dive in too deep to it, but you still want to teach them about the subject of history. This is still very important.
Status official by signing the Pact of Steel. Then, Hitler turned his eyes towards Poland and the hated Polish corridor, splitting Germany in two. At this point, the Allies really had to put their foot down, and they warned him that an invasion of Poland would mean war. Hitler had planned to continue his advance eastward, but he didn't want to end up fighting a war on two fronts. So for now, he made an alliance with Stalin, saying, how about we both invade Poland and split it between the two of us, and I definitely won't not refrain from not betraying you sometime in the future.
Yeah, I mean...
Sounds... good.
That's a really good way to do it. Because Stalin knew what was up. This is the most paranoid dude ever. He did not trust the skinny mustache man.
This new alliance stunned the West. On the 1st of September,
I would definitely be the same way. The momentary non-aggression pact or alliance between Germany and the Soviet Union, oh man.
Troops entered Poland, and Britain and France declared war on Germany.
There we go.
The Poles fought hard, but they were no match for the two giants crashing down on them from either side.
Can you even blame them? This is such a ridiculous situation to be put in. Germany on one side, the Soviets on the other. Like, how are you supposed to fight this? Maybe if the Poles just had to fight the Soviet Union, I don't know about at this time in 1939, but remember, to gain their independence right after World War I, they did win a war against the Soviets. That's why they existed after World War I in the first place.
Then came a period
the Soviets
known
had
as the
just got done fighting the Civil War,
just sort of sat around not
phony war,
much.
glad we're talking about this.
The French had launched a small invasion into the Saarland, but they maintained mostly defensive positions, and after a while decided to just turn around and call it a day.
Nobody wanted to keep fighting
the French were still super proud of their victory in World War I, and they hadn't really moved on from it. They still used horses, they dispatched messages by motorbike instead of using radio. Orders from the commander-in-chief were usually pretty vague.
Still using those World War I tactics 20 years later. What could go wrong?
Were rarely inspected. They built a line of defenses along their German border, but didn't bother extending it all the way to the channel. And they wouldn't launch
They're covering like every single subject. I should have reacted to this video a long time ago, just so I know like baseline what, you know, I mean, almost 100 million people understand, because 100 million people watch this video. Because I feel like sometimes I say things and people have no idea what the hell I'm talking about.
Against Germany out of fear of being retaliated against. In a war, they didn't want to attack the enemy. And at first the UK wasn't much better. Chamberlain still naively hoped that the war could be ended diplomatically. Instead of bombing raids, the RAF dropped propaganda leaflets over German cities, which one air marshal said likely did nothing but provide the continent with toilet paper for the duration of the war.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. Remember that a lot of this is all due to, like, I mean, the Germans were really angry people. I mean, they were punished almost entirely for World War I. The last thing they probably wanted to see is, you know, anything from the British. It probably, you know, motivated them more to want to fight.
Also only sent 200,000 men to France, while the French...
It's also like historical context too. Like, I understand that Neville Chamberlain was trying to be the good guy in the situation, but how many times was the British Empire honestly considered the good guy, historically speaking? Especially considering the other powers from around the world, specifically the Germans. So there's a lot of history back context you'd have to keep in mind. Same exact thing goes for the French. The Germans and French had a very big rivalry throughout history.
The French had mobilized millions. Both Britain and France wanted to avoid a repeat of the First World War.
The Germans were just not going to have it.
So they wanted to keep the war as far from home as possible. So they turned their eyes north, towards Norway. Neutral Sweden was exporting iron ore to Germany through neutral Norway, so the Allies asked them if they could please stop exporting iron ore to Germany, but this request was refused. Then the Soviet Union attacked Finland, so the Allies said, how about we land troops in Norway and move them across Sweden to go help out your good pal Finland, and along the way maybe take control of all your armfields. But Norway and Sweden still said no. So the UK mined the waters around Norway to force any transport ships into international waters, and they also attacked a German tanker they found in the area. Hitler realized what the Allies were up to, and he quickly moved to secure his supply of iron ore. He launched an invasion through Denmark in
6 hours. Are you going to say it?
Into Norway. The Allies rushed
Oh, you got to say it. Germany took Denmark in 6 hours, or at least Denmark surrendered in 6 hours.
And troops at key ports along the coast, but Germany had taken control of Norway's airfield, and their air superiority decided the fight.
What's crazy is they were able to do this without naval superiority. Obviously, the British had that, but they were still able to obviously successfully invade and capture all of Norway.
Allies rushed to land troops at key ports along the coast, but Germany had taken control of Norway's airfield, and their air superiority decided the fight. The Allies had to retreat. After this slightly
what a massive L from the Allies there. I don't think I really think about that enough. Like, that successful naval invasion of Norway, getting that dub over the Allies, getting that early dub over the Allies, that was a really big deal. That must have been scary reading the newspaper the next day.
Failure. Chamberlain resigned and was replaced with Winston Churchill.
Yeah, and then we're still not even done. We're still going to see the collapse of Paris.
Hitler's overall strategy was similar to Germany's First World War strategy. Attack France, defeat France, knocking out...
Well, I mean, it's similar to even further back behind that. The German Unification War, the Prussian-Franco War. This was almost 50 years before World War I. Again, a lot of this stuff just comes down to geography. At the end of the day, the geography is still the same. You're still going to have to use similar tactics to invade other countries.
The overall strategy was similar to Germany's First World War strategy. Attack France, defeat France, knocking out the UK in the process, then turn on the Soviet Union and win the war. During the phony war,
I mean, they were pretty close to doing that.
To prepare his forces. Now, he was ready to attack.
That phony war
had wanted to place troops in Belgium, but Belgium had refused, and in a move that surprised pretty much no one, Hitler launched an invasion to get around.
I mean, they already went through Belgium in World War I, so this probably wouldn't have been shocking. Even the French were probably expecting it because that's the whole purpose of the Maginot Line, force the Germans to go around.
Defenses. The Allies
it must have been a little bit surprising that they also decided to attack the Netherlands at the same time.
Into Belgium at full
they didn't do that
the German invasion head on, and it looked like a repeat of the First World War was coming. But this time, Hitler had a trick up his sleeve. Blitzkrieg. As the Germans advanced,
things were just
they
a lot
sent thousands of refugees westward, slowing down the Allies. Then, to the south, the French had left the Ardennes, an area full of hills and forests, pretty underdefended because they thought it was naturally impenetrable. Well, the Germans were about to penetrate it with everything they had. They smashed 50 Wehrmacht divisions through and encircled the Allied armies at lightning speed. The best of the Allied...
I mean, they were not prepared for how much military and warfare was going to change over the course of like 20 years. Everything was motorized. Everything was mechanized. A lot easier to take thousands of men, thousands of miles in a single day.
Armies and nearly wiping out the British too, but they managed to make a desperate last-minute escape at Dunkirk, with British civilian ships even making the perilous
Would have been scary if they weren't able to do that.
With most of the French forces depleted, the Germans breezed through, taking Paris, and France fell. What the Germans couldn't do in World War I, Hitler had done just like that.
In like 6 months.
Hitler hoped that with the fall of France, the UK would also lose hope and sue for peace. But quite annoyingly, it didn't. And he needed to secure the Western Front. So he tried to force them into submission with mind games. The UK were now all alone, and Hitler wanted to emphasize that. First of all, just before France fell, Italy finally declared war on the Allies, making the UK's situation even worse. Next, instead of just occupying all of France, Hitler occupied the coastal areas for defense, but allowed France to continue its existence as a German puppet state. This way, it looked like the UK's old ally had decided to switch sides. Hitler also hoped that the UK wouldn't attack any of her old allies' navy bases or colonies.
Yes, Britain's standing alone. This is that whole time period. Oh yeah, all the British colonies. They were gonna have to be really reliant on those.
Hitler also hoped that the UK wouldn't attack any of her old allies' navy bases or colonies in Africa, giving Hitler an extra line of defense to the south. But the UK made sure to respond to this by sailing down to France's navy base in Algeria and wrecking a bunch of ships. So have at it.
Yeah, that's a very good point to add. The small amount of times the British did have to fight the French in World War II.
Laying down plans for an invasion of Great Britain. Before German troops could land on British soil, he would first need air and naval superiority across the Channel. Waves of German bombers came, while the completely outnumbered RAF worked bravely around the clock in an attempt to quell the German attacks. At first, the Luftwaffe targeted British ports and coastal facilities. Then it attacked RAF bases, crippling the RAF's ability to defend the nation. And it looked like Hitler's Great British invasion was coming. But then, Churchill ordered a small, pretty insignificant bombing raid over Berlin. It didn't do much damage, but Hitler was furious, and he immediately ordered the Luftwaffe to refocus its attacks on civilian targets in London. Children were sent off to the countryside, away from their parents to avoid danger, and frequent trips to air raid shelters became a daily...
I don't know why I'm thinking of, didn't they talk about this in the Chronicles of Narnia? Why of all movies I'm thinking about right now? Literally the origin story of how the kids, got sent away from London, finding the wardrobe and all that.
Sent off to the countryside, away from their parents to avoid danger, and frequent trips to air raid shelters became a daily occurrence. But British morale held firm. Smiling, knitting, lounging casually, these people have balls of steel. This refocusing on London also gave the RAF breathing space to reorganize, so Hitler kind of shot himself in the foot there. Just a foot for now.
Yeah, finally, I was going to say, he's going to shoot himself even harder. He's going to blow his foot off, both of them.
Sent one massive all-out attack on London, and the RAF successfully repelled it, destroying many of the German aircraft and placing air superiority firmly in British hands.
So they have the naval, if they have the air, they're going to be safe.
Postponed, but the bombing of British cities continued for some time.
Yeah, I mean, this is really the one point. It's a great place to stop the story of World War II, because this is the point where Germany potentially wins World War II. Things go differently. They knock the UK out. They white peace, whatever. They let UK do whatever, but they sign an agreement. No more fighting. I can't even imagine. Germany probably goes after the Soviet Union. If it's just 1v1, Soviets probably don't make that. Probably can't get the dub if it's just them soloing each other. Imagine being an Italian kid in elementary school. You have a cool teacher. A few years later, he takes over your nation. It's a tradition to come and watch this every few months. Allies, what you got there? Germany has an army that very clearly defies the Treaty of Versailles. A smoothie. They only got a little and they felt cheated. That's a smooth way to say Britain and France violated their treaty obligations and refused to let Italy take the territory they promised. Oof. The way this dude says Czechoslovakia is so satisfying. If Napoleon saw how quickly France fell, he'd be disappointed. Yeah, he literally turning over in his grave.
So part two. Well, when I said Britain was all alone, that wasn't entirely true.
Love that he added that.
Many Commonwealth nations and other allied colonies...
I just forget, oh, no wonder the public... I really believe that Oversimplified probably taught so much of the public, especially so many kids, so many key details to massive historical events. It's like, oh, that's why people understand when I say certain things versus other things, not so much. We just need to wait for Oversimplified to roll out with a video about it, which I'm so sad. It's been a minute since he has released a video. It's been sad year. I think he only uploaded like once this year. Well, 3 videos about one event. Man, I wish he was doing at least 2 events a year.
Joined the war in Britain's support. They would play a key role throughout the war, particularly in the African and Italian campaigns. On the Axis side, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the defensive tripartite pact, bringing their military alliance even closer together. The Soviet Union's war against Finland should have been an easy victory, but it became a humiliating struggle, and their military ineptitude was put on full display. In the end, they did force the Finns to sue for peace.
Yeah, because, I mean, it's still up for debate. At the end of the day, the Finns, they did lose territory, but the morality victory, the moral victory, where the Finns actually did stand up, they didn't lose their entire independence, that's impressive.
Then, they continued their honorable campaign of pushing around much smaller countries by annexing the Baltic states and part of northern Romania. France's colonies in equatorial Africa were like, heck no, we aren't going to join the Germans, and they all pledged their allegiance to free France, except for Gabon, which had to be taken by military force. The Allies also tried to capture the strategic port of Dakar, but that ended in failure. Mussolini had seen Hitler's successes, and he thought now it was Italy's time to shine, so he tried to take British Somaliland, and that went pretty well. Then he tried to take Egypt, and that went less well. Then he tried to take Greece, and that went really badly. Churchill began referring to Italy as Europe's soft underbelly.
Yeah. I mean, that phrase
he began favoring a military
still isn't used today
and started sending British troops to Greece. All of this had Hitler pretty concerned, and he moved to protect his southern flank. He had been getting friendly with Hungary and twisted their arm into signing the Tripartite Pact and joining the Axis powers. Romania was also eager to join for protection against the Soviet Union. The Tripartite Pact was designed to prevent any other countries from deciding to join the Allies, specifically Britain's old ally, the pesky United States of America. When war first broke out, American public opinion was strongly against joining in. In 1940, there was an election. The Republican candidate said, "I will not send any young Americans to die in Europe," and sitting President Franklin D. Roosevelt said, "I will also not send any young Americans to die in Europe. Unless I have to, then I might." And Roosevelt won. Churchill...
Bam. The U.S. just loves to be isolationist. They've been trying to do that forever, and it never goes well. It just doesn't happen. No matter how much the American public try to do it.
Asked him to join the war, but Roosevelt said, "No can do, Winston. But you know what? Here, have some weapons." America began supplying the Allies with food and munitions, but there was one problem. German U-boats were sinking thousands of Allied supply ships.
This is why they also needed to figure out a way to get the British out of the war, because inevitably the U.S. would come to the British's aid, of course.
Including American ones. If the Germans could sever Britain's supply line, the UK would starve. Throughout the war, the Allies had to come up with better technology to fight the U-boats. Improved radar, aircraft with longer range, better weaponry and convoy tactics.
Yeah, the technological leaps forward during this massive conflict, it's hard to comprehend. Like, so much of our technology today was built off of like the technological research we were doing to up our military during the Second World War.
Hold a meeting and said, "Pykrete. You take some wood, you take some ice, you put them together, you get pykrete." And then he pulled out a gun and shot some wood and it shattered. And then he shot some pykrete and the bullet ricocheted off it and hit someone else in the conference room.
Oops.
Then they tried to make a pykrete aircraft carrier, but that idea was scrapped because that's a really dumb idea. In the end, Alan Turing and his team of codebreakers cracked Germany's Enigma code, and the U-boats gradually became less and less of a threat. Back in Africa,
huge thing there, because the Germans had to be sly and secret with their U-boats. Obviously, they still didn't have naval supremacy, but they were able to still terrorize the sea with these submarines. Once they cracked that code, it was finally like, okay, they can 100% take back the oceans now.
Decided to push Italy out of
Egypt. Or at least
be
on the way to do that.
Easy. So they kept going. Hitler realized he was going to have to finally step in and do something. He went to Bulgaria and
This is ultimately why maybe having Spain on Germany's side wouldn't have helped, and it would have just been more of a headache, just like Italy was, because maybe the Spanish would have just lost more battles in Iberia, letting the Allies get a foothold in continental Europe.
Yugoslavia and said, "Hey, I'm going to move troops through you to get to Greece, so either join us or, be invaded." Bulgaria opted to join them. Yugoslavia opted to be invaded. Then Greece finally fell to the joint German-Italian invasion.
Part of it.
The British had moved troops from North Africa to fight in Greece, which helped Rommel and his tank divisions push the British back to Egypt. And they could have kept going, but a small, mostly Australian force held out under siege for 8 months in Tobruk, denying the Germans a strategic port city and disrupting their supply line. Despite having some success in the Middle East, the British didn't seem like any real threat for now. Hey, Soviet Union, look out. With 3 million troops, Hitler launched the largest ground invasion in history.
Like how that just came out of left field. We weren't expecting that.
Stalin was far from ready. Both Churchill and Roosevelt had...
That's exactly, it's a good way to like show how much of a, I mean, somewhat of a surprise. It might have been also somewhat expected by Stalin. He just probably wasn't expecting it at that exact moment. Dude, watch out, FDR
but he dug
says.
his head in the sand, and the Soviets didn't stand a chance. Germany made staggering progress, with huge encircling movements capturing mind-boggling numbers of Russian troops.
Yeah.
250,000 at Bialystok, Minsk, 300,000 at Smolensk, nearly 700,000 at Kiev, and again at Vyazma and Bryansk. Leningrad was put under a siege that would last an insufferable 4 years. The invasion of Russia had been Hitler's main ideological goal from the beginning, and his hatred for the ethnic peoples there was now
That's why, like, just white peacing with Britain, I mean, he wanted that. If he could have done that, he was fine with the West. Like, this is really what he wanted, all this stuff.
In all its fury. The Eastern Front of the Second World War was brutal for all that endured it.
Yes.
The Germans were now inside of Moscow.
Like literally absolute nightmare mode. I think about it way too much. Eastern Front, can't imagine what that would have been like. Probably some of the most horrific, one of the most horrific places you could be in human history.
All over. But then it happened. It got cold. Stupid cold. Hitler had hoped the Soviets would give up before winter, but they kept fighting. His commanders came to him and said, "Can we please dig in for the winter and wait until spring?" "No. Keep going." But oil is
he probably should have just turned back a little bit, to be honest.
Keep going. We're having to leave the corpses of our frozen horses by the side of the road so we can still find our way in the snowdrift. Perfectly normal. Keep going. Hitler hadn't given his millions of men winter clothing and supplies because he thought he really should have won by now. Then Stalin...
I mean, okay, so to put yourself in his perspective, he had literally taken out Denmark in 6 hours. I don't know why I'm picking on Denmark so much here. Apparently, I've got family from Denmark. I think it's okay. But yeah, I mean, he was just like picking off other nations in the West, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, so quickly. I guess you can kind of see where he was coming from. Like, he thought he was going to be able to wipe out the Soviets really fast because he was doing that literally months beforehand. This was the biggest country on earth, the Soviet Union. And also an extremely cold country.
Specially trained to fight in the extreme cold.
So very, very different situation, but I can see why he made that mistake.
They were now being pushed back. They had no choice but to dig in and wait for winter to end. Germany's victories were staggering, and Japan was eager not to miss the victory bus. Their war in China had come to a standstill.
Another thing that people say too is that Stalin was really fearful of the Japanese Empire invading in Siberia, so he had a lot of his troops out there, or a lot of his resources tied up on the other side. Again, it's the biggest country on earth, so it's a long time to get them over there. So once he figured out the Japanese weren't really going to do anything, he was able to take those resources back and fight against Germany.
But they wanted to keep expanding their sphere of influence.
Yeah, see, they're not doing anything up there.
They began.
And that's because the Japanese had their hands full with the Chinese, and they wanted resources from Indonesia. They needed that oil
southward. But there was a problem. Southeast Asia was heavily colonized by America and Great Britain. It was also full of ocean. Ocean meant naval combat, and there was no way the Japanese Navy could stand up to the US and the UK. So they thought, wouldn't it be nice if we could destroy their navies before we begin our conquest?
Just knock them out.
And so it was. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise air raid on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and inflicted a huge amount of damage. They also
and it was rough, and they didn't want it, but at the same time, Winston Churchill was probably the happiest man on earth the day that happened because he knew the USA was going to come help him out. And FDR secretly wanted to figure out a way to join the war. He just had to convince the public to do it.
Roosevelt had no choice but to declare war on Japan, and so did Churchill. Hitler then declared war on America, even though he totally didn't have to. The attack on Pearl Harbor seemed like a big Japanese victory, but they didn't attack any of the naval repair yards, fuel storage tanks, or the submarine base, meaning the Pacific Fleet would be up and running again pretty soon.
And all the ships weren't there.
The Japanese were able to begin their conquest. They took Guam, the Gilbert Islands, Wake Island, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. They forced
because remember, the Americans had the Philippines at the time.
Thailand to join them so they could march their troops through to Malaya. They swept through Singapore, North Borneo, the East Indies, New Guinea, the Solomons, and they were now threatening northern Australia.
They were doing air raids on Australia. That's crazy.
Borders of India. Japan's victory had been...
Look how huge. I'm always impressed. And I show this map like every single week. I'm still impressed at how big the Japanese Empire got at this time.
Staggering as the Germans, and it reinforced the Japanese idea that this was a divine war which they were destined to win. But their victories had been based on speed, not power. And power would eventually catch up with them.
Manhattan Project.
For now, though, in all occupied nations,
that's a great foreshadow.
The people suffered. Persecution, forced labor, harsh punishments for any who spoke out against their occupiers. In Europe, the Nazis were rounding up ethnic minorities and other unwanted groups and individuals. In particular, millions of Jewish people would suffer through the terrible events of the Holocaust. Brave resistance movements rose up in defiance of their invaders, while the people held out for hope. And hope was coming. Winter was over, and Hitler could continue his push eastward. But this time, he switched up his strategy. He wanted to focus on the south. His plan was to cut off the Russian armies in the Caucasus, an area full of oil, and then invade the Caucasus and take over the oil. His forces moved across the north with ease, and Hitler got cocky.
And without the Soviets having that, that'd be
army south early, leaving the 6th Army to complete the encircling movement alone. To do so, the 6th Army had to reach and take the key Soviet city of Stalingrad. The Russians defended it fiercely, and Stalingrad saw some of the harshest fighting of the entire war. The Soviets held up the German advance for 5 months as they battled in the war-torn city, which bought them valuable time. When the Germans had first launched their invasion a year earlier, the Soviets had moved their factories to the east. Those factories had been building a butt-ton of tanks and aircraft and getting the Soviet army up to scratch. Now, it was ready.
Now they had the war economy ready.
And improved forces around the city. And in an attack that resembled Hitler's own encirclement tactics, they began surrounding the 6th Army. That was the thing. I mean, in order for this strategy to have worked, see, that's the scary thing. It's not scary. It must have been terrifying for Hitler when he realized, oh, he wasn't going to just knock out the Soviets as fast as he thought. And the moment he didn't do that, even though he had so much land in Russia, he knew, oh crap, I'm about to get my butt kicked. Even though he had created this massive Reich, because the front lines had just been frozen in the Soviet Union, well, pardon the pun, a lot of those high-ranking Germans knew this was almost over. Basically, they couldn't knock him out fast enough. The Soviet Union was so big, so massive, so much population that once they got the ball rolling, it was just going to be snowball. Retreat, but Hitler said,
their military was just going to start to snowball. More powerful. There it is.
The entire 6th Army was trapped and had to surrender. With complete air superiority, the Soviets started pushing westward. For Stalin, it was a resounding victory. For Hitler, an absolute catastrophe.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Like, he already knew he was going to take a massive L here.
Also,
they still fought.
Hitler elsewhere. With America now in the war, Allied bombing over
that was the other aspect of it. You now have America joining in.
Cities reached devastating levels.
Dresden.
In Africa, the British had pushed Rommel back again. Then they were pushed back again, and finally, after a decisive battle at El Alamein, and with American and British troops arriving in the west, the Germans and Italians were squeezed out of Africa. Japan
1943. By the end, it's like they should have just called it. I'm sure he wanted to call it. He wanted to peace out, but they weren't going to let him.
Its rapid success being turned around. They attempted to take the island of Midway, but the U.S. Navy was ready for the attack, and they sank Japan's carrier. Actually,
now Midway was a big turning point also,
from which the Japanese Navy would never recover.
In the Pacific
British,
Theater.
Indian, and Chinese troops held the line in the harsh jungle terrain of Burma, and the Japanese suffered losses in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea. They began to realize they were not invincible. With the Axis out of Africa, the Allies had to decide their next move. Churchill still wanted to attack from the south, while the Americans preferred a full sea invasion in northern France. All right, said the Americans, we'll do it your way. Allied forces
they started with the
landed in Sicily and
Italian
began moving north. They also carried out bombing raids over Rome. The thing was, many of the people in Sicily had relatives living in America, and they greeted the American troops quite warmly. With the war reaching home territory, most Italians just weren't that into it, and Mussolini was suddenly very unpopular. He was voted out by his own fascist Grand Council and was toppled from power.
The Germans had to go in there, help him out.
Immediately began negotiations for surrender. Hitler wasn't surprised and had already sent reinforcements southward. In an operation he ironically called Operation Axis, German troops quickly disarmed Italian troops in the north. The Allies continued fighting the Germans up through Italy, but then winter set in, meaning mud, and everything slowed to a halt. All right, said the Americans,
everything did
let's do
freeze
it our
right
way
there
as well. Germany had made itself a lot of enemies, and millions of Allied troops had been gathering in England as factories worked around the clock producing the war material needed for a super crazy massive, the likes of which the world has never seen before invasion of Europe. The Germans knew an Allied invasion would come, but they didn't know where it would land.
So they started setting up like tons of defensive all along these coasts for thousands and thousands of miles.
Tactics, they thought there was a pretty good chance it would come at Calais, but the Allies were really going to land in Normandy because it was less fortified and the beaches were nicer. Under the careful planning of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the invasion
show the picture where he's like
was just about
he's all cute and stuff. Yeah, there we go. Fabulous.
Ready to go. Just one thing was preventing the launch: the British weather. For a short while, everyone sat around waiting for a decent day, and then it came. On the night of June 5th, over 1,000 bombers took off and raided coastline defenses, while paratroopers were dropped inland in a bit of a chaotic operation, tasked with sabotaging defenses and capturing key bridges to stop any German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Early the next morning, the barrage came. As Allied ships fired,
I don't know what job I'd want, but I definitely wouldn't want to be a paratrooper. I don't think I'd want to be in a submarine either. I don't know. Let me be a part of the ice cream ship. The U.S. had a massive ship just for ice cream. Let me just give people ice cream scoops.
Shells at the German fortifications, and then the landings. The Americans at Utah and Omaha, the British at Golden Sword, and the Canadians at Juneau. It was a tremendous struggle with a great loss of life, particularly at Omaha, but the Allied troops captured the beaches and the landings were a success. Then they began their movements inland. They took the port of Cherbourg and the city of Caen. The Americans
at that point, with the landing successful,
then, in a massive disaster for the Germans, British and Canadian troops from the north and Americans from the south trapped the German 7th Army in a near wipeout encircling movement. In August, Allied troops landed in the south of France to little resistance. On one beach, all they found was a Frenchman handing out champagne. Paris was liberated, and the Germans were pushed out of France.
Now they talk about the southern
Belgium.
French
in the Far
invasion
East,
too.
the Allies started to push the Japanese out of Burma, as the Americans launched a two-pronged offensive in the Pacific. In the south, General MacArthur led the push to liberate the Philippines, while General Nimitz oversaw the brutal island-hopping campaign. American forces had to make hard-fought landing after hard-fought
So many
landing
great
on
movies
fiercely
about
defended
all these
small
different
islands
events.
as they moved
I'm thinking about all these different
towards the Japanese mainland.
things,
the Japanese
movies, books,
believed that
TV
the
shows.
greatest thing a person could do was to die in battle, and the most dishonorable act was to surrender. As a result, they fought ferociously to the very end. And the closer the Americans got to the mainland, the more ferocious the resistance became.
That
In
was the
February
thing about
1945
both the Japanese and the Germans. They just did not give, even in the complete face and obvious face of defeat, they just would not stop.
The Americans captured the island of Iwo Jima, and an intense
The Germans knew it was
firebombing
over,
campaign of Japan's
but they kept
leading
on
cities
fighting.
began. The Allies suffered some setbacks trying to liberate the Netherlands, but they were making progress and were now threatening the industrial
Battle of the
heartland
Bulge.
of Germany. Hitler's health, both mentally and physically, was rapidly deteriorating. Things were looking bad, and he was desperate.
There's theories he had Parkinson's disease. There's all those videos of him like shaking.
We need to turn this thing around. And
That
now
could have
just
also
the
been all
trick.
the substances
Remember
he was
a few
on at the
years
same
back
time,
when
though.
we blitzkrieged through the Ardennes and trapped
Maybe
the Allied
both.
forces in Belgium? Well, I'm going to do
here's
the
Battle of the
exact same
Bulge.
thing. Again. He gathered his forces and tried to pound them through the Ardennes. He used up the remainder of Germany's strength and resources, and he managed to create quite a nice bulge. He also trapped some American forces in the Belgian town of Bastogne. The Germans sent the trapped Americans a message saying surrender or be annihilated. When it was read out to the commanding officer, he said, "They want to surrender? No, sir, they want us to surrender." Nuts! And that's what they sent off as their official reply. General Patton's
Nuts.
Third Army then managed to break the siege from the southwest, and the
Crazy.
Germans were pushed back. Hitler's last-ditch attempt had failed, and what followed was a total collapse of the German forces. The Allies pushed into Germany from both sides. The Soviet Union took Warsaw and kept pushing to Berlin. In his bunker, Hitler realized all hope was lost. Berlin
Dang.
fell, and with it, Hitler's...
I like how the map's accurate. Oversimplified did such a great job with the map here. That's another reason why this video is such a banger. Like, every piece of information, like, clearly did his research. I don't think there's a single line in here that isn't true. It's crazy.
dreams of a great German empire. 2 of the Axis nations had been knocked out. 1 to go. The Americans began their assault on Okinawa, the last island
You could
before they would
argue
reach
different
the Japanese
points
mainland. The desperate
in a different
Japanese
way,
fought hard,
but for
launching
the most part,
kamikaze
the way he
attacks
says
on
everything
US ships.
is
The citizens of Okinawa suffered through the
so
terrible
well.
fighting, but in 2 months, the island was captured. The Allies now had to make a choice. Either continue the devastating struggle up the Japanese mainland, or they could try to coerce the Japanese into surrendering.
Yep, all the
now.
Purple Hearts
In
were
July,
made
the first
for the
successful atomic bomb test
2.4
took
million
place in New Mexico, and the destructive weapons
soldiers
was
they
ready
thought they were
for
going to
use.
lose in the
America
Japanese
and the UK
invasion.
were also seeing the Soviet Union not so much liberating as occupying its captured territories, and so they wanted to put on a show of force. On August 6th, the A-bomb fell on Hiroshima. Then, on the 9th, Nagasaki.
crazy how World War II video just sets
The
up the
cities
Cold
were
War
reduced to
video.
rubble, and for the people living there, it was a terrible
Which I don't think
fate.
he's made a
But for
Cold
the
War
Allies,
video, but
it achieved their main aim. In September, the Emperor announced Japan's surrender,
you can
saying
see
the war
map.
situation has developed not necessarily to
Germany.
Japan's advantage. After 6 years, war was finally over. The Allies occupied Japan for 8 years. The Emperor was allowed to keep his position, but General MacArthur made sure this picture was printed in the Japanese press to display to the Japanese people that their Emperor was not the divine, powerful being they had believed.
Not
Germany
Chad.
was divided between America, the UK, France, and the Soviet Union. In 1949, the Allied sectors were united into West Germany. The Second World War had been more terrible and destructive than the first.
Yes,
In
which
its
the first was really, really bad too. So it's crazy that the sequel was even more.
Aftermath, 2 major superpowers with 2 very different ideologies had come out victorious, and the tension between the 2 of them would create a new kind of war. A very, very cold one.
Ha, 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 ha. I'm sorry, what am I talking about? He does have a Cold War video. It's literally the second most popular video. Why do I really not remember that one? That's a long historical event to cover. Anyways, of course, this video is by Oversimplified. Let's hope he comes out with another video soon. And here are my patrons.
I finally escaped from Drew's basement.
Lucas, the Canadian Christmas trees.
Honk,
Argentinian Grandpa,
I'm back, boys.
DOOCHBAGGINS. Imperial Japan
Kirino
flag is the
is
same as
best
modern
girl.
Japan.
Koyle.
Please stop making this mistake. It's
Amateur
Archaeology.
aPhatNarwhal.
Carmel
S.
Connor Pavlik. DaBeautiful-MEGAN-Underwood.
I can't
Fredrik
sleep
Tibblin.
without
InquisitorXarius.
Drew's.
Tambre.
KingBearHaze.
Mexican
And
76.